After a disgusting Liberal victory in Canada, Alberta has a concrete pathway to become the 51st state, and I'm going to show you how. First and foremost, let's just take a look at what happened in this election. In 2025, we saw Pierre Poilievre basically fumble a 90% chance of winning to Mark Carney over this whole tariff debacle. But if you do look at the state of Alberta over here, you'll notice that they won all but 2 of 37 seats, or rather 3, in that province. In fact, it's so conservative that they're now pleading with their premier, who is a woman who met with Trump in Mar-a-Lago prior to the election of Carney, pleading that they become a 51st state. As we can all see here, obviously there are thousands of people that are showing up at the Capitol, rallying today, yesterday also, to basically have this petition filled the hell out. We even have what is the equivalent of the governor of Alberta more or less implying and dog whistling the fact that they do want to secede from Canada.
It's very clear that I and my caucus support Alberta sovereignty within a united Canada, and we will defend our constitutional jurisdiction just as we did today in announcing that we are going to challenge the net zero power regs in the court of law as a violation of our constitution, but also as a safety issue, Mr. Speaker. We just saw what happened in Spain and Portugal when the power went out 3 days ago. That is the kind of thing that we want to avoid here. That is the kind of thing the federal government should not be interfering with, and I would invite the members opposite to actually stand with us in fighting the federal government to get our jurisdiction back.
So that does not look like a person that's running a state that is at all friends with the government federally. Now, Mike Carney won by the slightest of margins, has a minority government, will likely not be in power for longer than 2 years at this point, is somebody who has a worse relationship with the presumptive governor of Alberta than does Gavin Newsom with Donald Trump at this point. The acrimony is very much palpable. Now, one last clip on why this head of government is actually looking to completely leave the country.
I'm also Premier of Alberta, and quite frankly, at some point, Canada has to start working for Alberta, and it's not right now. We have a number of policies that came in over the last 10 years that have been damaging to Alberta prosperity. It's been damaging to our freedom as a province, and if they persist, it is going to continue a dysfunctional relationship that harms Alberta. So I put forward the 9 major policies that I think have to be repealed after the next election. Unfortunately, the current Prime Minister, despite what he said to me privately when he was here, has now gone public saying he supports export taxes, he supports Bill C-69, he supports emissions caps. That is moving in the wrong direction. So we will get through this election. We'll see who ends up winning, and I will continue to advocate for those.
Now that you now know that the head of government in the state, or the province rather, definitely wants out by all means and has been complaining for a while, it seems, and lambasting the prime minister, whether it be Trudeau or Carney, over their policies that are already hurting the province, but then also the ones that are proposed down the pike. And I'll tell you some of these as well. So basically, there's a proposed tax for people that are selling their homes. That's it. That's it. A tax not to buy a house, not to even to sell it to a big company, but if you sell it to some other person, you pay a tax on that. And so all the boomers that voted for the Liberals to keep things the same, to keep their housing prices up, it turns out that they're getting bit in the butt now because Mark Carney is proposing raising taxes on people that are selling their homes in the first place. On top of that debauchery, you have to keep in mind this too. There is such a thing as a algorithm, believe it or not, where Alberta pays more to the other provinces than the other way around. So they're getting ripped off literally. So as we all know, in a federal system, some states, some provinces make more than others. However, the lopsidedness cannot be underscored in this case with Canada. If you look here, Alberta's net contribution to Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, has been more than $244 billion in a 15-year span up until 2022. Now, if you look at the contributions of the other 12 provinces, you'll notice that all the big ones are actually net negatives, aside from 2, which would be, I guess, Ontario and British Columbia. Now, they're still not contributing nearly as much per capita as does Alberta. And Alberta has a population of about 5 million people, which is no bigger than a state like Arizona, which in and of itself is a medium-sized state. What I mean here is that they've been bleeding money to a federal government that has been actively screwing them over, especially these past 10 years under Trudeau, who's like the vanilla Obama but dumber, who apparently is proposing, and as was Mark Carney, proposing a zero net emission standard. And what's wrong with this is that they're now taxing industry that releases carbon into the air, as in oil manufacturers and other companies. And the problem with that is that the majority of the economy of Alberta is going to be derived from oil. Now, if you want to look at American and Canadian oil production, look no further than this image right here. If you'll notice, of course, it's mostly Canada, a lot of the Midwest, but then also you look at Alberta. Alberta, in and of itself, produces about 85% of Canadian oil. If you see, there's a little trickle, a little scat stain right here near the capital, but generally speaking, 80% or like 4 out of 5, quantities of oil in Canada is produced in just one province out of 13. This same province, by the way, is the richest province. They make like 30% more money than do the most populated places in Canada, such as the GTA and the Toronto area. But then also on top of that, like I said, 80% of their oil goes to just them. And so the problem there is that if they were to leave, they would basically pigeonhole Canada and they'd be completely reliant on America. Now, this feeds into the whole Trump empire narrative where he wants there to be a big, beautiful state of Canada, which might be happening in the future if the first domino falls, that being the huge one of Alberta. This meme really gets to the bottom of it, folks. So on the left, you've got an Albertan choosing the path of American, or rather Albertan independence, booming economy fueled by resources, which they have a lot of. I think they have, 170, if not 170 billion barrels of oil. And by the way, that is so much oil that, like I said, it's 80% of the economy in Canada. But beside that, it would be 30% of an increase in America. So it's like if you added Texan oil production, but in the north to us. So that's why adding the state would be massive. If you increase the amount of oil in America by 30%, not only would the Middle East lose a ton of profit, a lot of market share, as does Russia, but also we'd be selling more oil to the Europeans, more oil to the Mexicans even. And on top of that, the price of gas in America would drop, let's say $1. And so, I mean, it's a really big boon that could happen feasibly. And of course, on the right, you've got the path of staying in Canada, carbon taxes, equalization payments, which is, like I said, bleeding money to the other provinces to subsidize their immigrants and whatnot, and federal overreach, which the Prime Minister, or rather the Premier/Governor, had pointed out earlier in this video. No, Canadians themselves have been stepping up on their own propaganda, okay? The Albertans are really seeing the unfairness of the whole Canadian system. Keep in mind that a very, very small geographic portion of the country of Canada voted in Mark Carney, who sucks, by the way, and people to the west of Ontario basically get gypped. Even the people like in the Black Quebecois have more of a say in the government than do the conservative heartland Canadians of Alberta and even Saskatchewan. You can call Manitoba also a part of that contingent. But if you look at this propaganda, you'll notice that the province of Alberta has about 4.5 million people with 37 federal seats. The maritime provinces, so like the small part near New Brunswick, has 2.5 million people and 32 federal seats. So each voter in Atlantic Canada, so the Far East, has 55% more representation than an Albertan, which is ridiculous. So basically what they're saying here is that if there were to be, let's say 10 people in Eastern Canada, that equal about 15 Albertan votes, which is completely unfair. I mean, we heard about the 3/5 compromise. This is mathematically, I think, worse even. So I, of course, asked ChatGPT to compile a lot of the notable movements that have been leading to this sort of a secession movement that will, I think, climax pretty soon. So if you look at what happened recently, there was an amendment to the Citizen Initiative Act, reducing the signature requirement for a referendum to leave Canada to only 10% of provincial electors, the equivalent being about 293,000 signatures. So they basically cut in half the amount of people you would need to start a vote in the first place. So again, a very strong move that is basically unprecedented by the Premier of Canada, which kind of shows where the intentionality is by, again, the Premier of Alberta. Now, increased secession sentiment, of course, I've already talked about this. Basically, people ever since that election have basically doubled in support for leaving the country, now that they don't really have a hope of having a conservative leader like they should have, and instead they have a guy who will materially make Alberta worse for the sake of the eastern provinces and British Columbia. Now, I also wanted to cover how this would affect the elections in America. Now, a lot of people are anti-annexing Canada as a whole, or even smaller parts of it, because Canada is mostly liberal, and that's completely true. Even conservatives in Canada are typically more leftist than are Republicans in America. So think Donald Trump as a hegemon of Republican politics here, whereas in Canada, we're talking about Mitt Romney being the Trump equivalent, if that makes sense. And so that is a valiant point. However, you would see that when Carney loses Alberta by like 40%, and Saskatchewan, which is the neighboring state in Canada, is also super conservative, you'll notice that maybe these two specific provinces are not so much of a liability. Now, as we all know, there is a Republican majority in the House of Representatives that's quite slight. We have a decent majority in the Senate, albeit by maybe 3 or 4 votes. And if you notice this algorithm, you'll notice that the equation posits that if you were to add Alberta, it would add 6 to 7 House seats. Because again, if you add to the population, you need to reappropriate what congressman goes to where. And so by that I mean that come the next census, you'll see states like California and Illinois lose seats and have Florida and Texas, Arizona add seats. And so if you were to add, let's say, population size of 5 million, theoretically, that would equate to about 6 or 7 seats, which 5 of which would probably be Republican. Now, our House majority is about 5 people strong. And so by that, I mean that if you were to add Alberta, you would basically double the majority we have already, which would be a godsend because we can barely get anything passed, as is with the slim pickings we have in Congress. Now, each state also gets 2 senators. Okay, that's controversial, I know, but California gets 2, Alaska gets 2, Rhode Island gets 2. That's the way it works. Now, there's 100 senators, and the Senate is going to be likely Republican going into the future. That's a separate video topic. However, if you look at the Senate apportionment, you're going to add 2 Republicans easily in the new state of Alberta if it were to happen. If you look at the formula also, there would be 7 congressional seats plus 2 Senate seats, which in the equation for the Electoral College means 9 votes more for Trump. So again, that would boost Trump's margin against Kamala theoretically to about 321 to 226, or something slightly different than that. Alberta Electoral College-wise, just to break it down even more simply, would be pretty similar to places like Colorado or Minnesota. In the map here, Minnesota gets 10 votes. Colorado gets 10 as well. So it'd be like one of these. So it's like if Trump were to flip Minnesota, this would be more or less what it would look like. Now, as an Easter egg towards the end of the video, let's add if Saskatchewan were to join. Saskatchewan is a lot easier to flip as it's obviously conservative, but yet a lot smaller. Population of only about 1 million. House seats would be 1 or 2 maybe, max. Plus 2 senators would equal about 3 or 4 electoral votes. So think about the electoral votes for Alaska or maybe Hawaii, Rhode Island, etc. So kind of to show you what would happen to the map is that you would basically, let's say, flip Minnesota as the equivalent for Alberta, and then a smaller flip for Trump in this case would be maybe the state of New Hampshire, and then that would be 326 to 212. Now, why this is important, even though Trump would have won regardless of whatever math happens here, is that it makes it easier to win swing states. So for example, if Trump already had a cushion of, let's say, 12 more electoral votes than otherwise, then what would happen is that he could afford to lose Wisconsin and be fine. He could afford to lose Michigan and be fine. In fact, he could lose Pennsylvania, he'd be fine. He could even lose Nevada and he would still win. Okay, so that's why it's actually a great boon for Donald Trump and Republicans in the future, because this would happen after several years of, ballots and all this. Basically, Republicans would get a big boost from adding these 2 places, and even if it's just Alberta, still a big win. Now, again, that would be an extra 4 senators. It would be an extra dozen Republican congressmen in the House. Big. And last but not least, it would also increase our oil production by 30%. Helping us reach energy independence and also making other people dependent on us. And it would also have the knock-on effect of making Canada that much weaker and making it easier to then capitulate the other states, whether it be Quebec, British Columbia, Manitoba, etc. So to answer all of your questions, will Alberta secede from Canada? Honestly, after all of that hype, probably not. Give it a 20% chance. It's too far out. We still have a couple months to see whether or not there's enough signatures for this sort of thing to happen. However, I will tell you that this is still a win, because if Albertans fail to succeed, even the fact that they're talking about it is showing that liberal leadership is failing in Canada, and I think that will have ripple effects that will bode well for Trump and other people that want to annex places like Greenland, etc. So anyways, like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want more content like this, comment down below any thoughts you have, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Adios.